Afternoon, everyone. My name is Amalia. So I'm the University Archivist at California State University, Dominguez Hills. And this is one of the 23 campuses of the California State University system. We're located about 15 miles from downtown Los Angeles, or in the south side of LA. We neighbor historically Black, Latinx, and Asian communities in cities like Torrance, Compton, Watts, and Carson, among others. So I'm discussing two projects that I've worked on, one an instruction session for college students and some high school students in the mix of that cohort, and a local history workshop explicitly for high school girls. So who I am, I think, so in addition to obviously being an archivist by title and a librarian by job classification, tenure track status, my identity as an educator and a public historian is really central to what I do, and my passion for public history and local history is really at the center of my professional identity. So it's sort of natural that I gravitated to these type of projects in my work. It's also key to note that in terms of my positionality, I grew up in South Los Angeles, next door to Compton, and the working class communities that our campus now serves. So this history is also very much mine, that of my family, my community. So learning this is an ongoing and never-ending process. So I bring both the historical scholarship, my own research, and of course my own experiences to bear when I teach and work with students. So the first instruction session, first project, was with the nonprofit Color Compton. So our campus, again, is located just a few miles from the city of Compton. And we hold various collections that span early 20th century Compton to Compton of the 1980s. Of course, as in many repositories, there is a gap, right, from 1980s on. That's the area where we don't currently have collections. That's the history of the now. And we very much acknowledge that. So the nonprofit actually reached out to us for a tour, and I took this as a perfect opportunity to actually suggest a formal instruction session, since the students visiting were, mostly were undergraduate students that formed part of an archival fellows program. Some were high school students. So I'll share some activities from last summer and then their recent visit this summer as well. So for the theme of the lesson from 2022, I chose demographic changes in Compton. This idea, of course, stemmed from my own experience growing up in the area, and not really understanding the historical roots at play that changed the community from, predominantly white suburb into a Black community, and then now into a primary Latinx community. So in my experience working with undergrads here at Dominguez Hills and sort of teaching these topics, this seems to be a story that, of course, isn't taught in schools in K-12. And I always feel really, really compelled to, and to some extent, an obligation, right, to bring this to the forefront, especially when we have the primary sources to tell it. So, and, the concepts and themes of gentrification, conversations around racism, police brutality, housing discrimination, they are in the students' radar, especially after the 2020 protest, and the fact that so many of the working class communities that they belong to are being displaced by exorbitant housing costs in Los Angeles as we speak. So the students are really living a lot of this. So for this activity, I created stations throughout a reading room. It was a relatively small group, about 12 students. So it was small enough where they would be able to walk around the room. And first, I gave them just a chance to explore the documents, because I wanted every student to have the chance to see everything. So, I wanted them to scan, to read, to just get an impression. And then after that is when I asked them to sort of pick something and pair up and choose a document. And that's when, of course, I brought up the document questioning activity that I usually use in my formal instruction with undergraduates as well. This is a snapshot of the slide deck. We then, shared responses to their items, and then I shared a video from LA historian talking about the theme of demographic changes in Compton. And after the video, I asked them to respond to it. And the goal was for them to sort of piece together the items that they were looking at, and to sort of identify the theme of demographic changes on their own. Like, what do all these sort of items tell you from the 1910s, 1920s, and so on and so forth, right? So then they came back this year for another lesson. And this time, because of course, there's only so much that we can cover in the sort of hour and a half that I had with him last year. And when I talked to the director of the organization, we picked the theme of the Watts Uprisings because we also have a lot of Watts collections, Watts history collections, especially a lot of these issues of the LA Times and the LA Free Press as well. So I wanted to connect how the uprisings related to the history of Compton, of course, white flight and all these changes. So this time I didn't use a document analysis worksheet. I wanted to focus more on media analysis. So we looked at some videos from CBS report, like raw videos of CBS, of the reporting, videos of the Associated Press, and sort of looked at tone and language. And then we also did comparisons with the newspapers. And I think the students had a lot of fun and a lot of insight, right? Because these students are also from the community. And then just zooming by to the next project. So this was a Girls Empowerment Summit, and this was also this past spring. So this was part of partnership with Compton and Unified School Districts. So I actually partnered with a former colleague who now works with educational partnerships in Compton. So in addition to teaching with sources, a goal for me was just exposure that continues to be part of my practice and sort of a goal of mine in sort of everything I do, from the teaching to the outreach to the archival work. So exposing a lot of these Black and Brown young girls to library and archive spaces, and exposing them to the fact that this is a career where their experiences and cultural knowledge could, prove to be very invaluable. So it was a day filled with workshops. So we had a ton, it was a full program. So we had professionals from other areas, from self-care. We had a meditation. We did a workshop on higher ed opportunities from a current undergrad student that's soon to graduate. We had an entrepreneur come and give a workshop. We also had one on financial literacy. And then of course, mine on local history was at the end. And we had about 4 to 45 girls in attendance. So we provided lunch for them. We did a campus tour. And then the last part, the history lesson, I provided a small workshop talking about the work of archivists, introduced what an archive is, how we function, how the profession is changing, and working toward preserving community stories and rectifying mistakes of the past. So the theme that the history is ours was at the center of the workshop for the high school girls, and the notion that we are part of this story was very central. So I urge students to think about how our existence in these communities continues as stories. So I pulled out materials from Compton, Inglewood High, which I think they found really fun and interesting. That included, of course, yearbooks, pamphlets, and other ephemeral materials. And I think this work continues. I think it was the start. I'm going into my second year in the profession. I mean, in this position, and this was actually the first year that we've been completely in person. So I think this was the start of what I hope to be ongoing momentum, and being able to sort of leverage these partnerships and continuing these programs year to year, and maybe even expanding them to other schools or other nonprofits. Thank you.
Thanks, Amalia. I'm going to take over the screen share here. While I get this set up, I wanted to say I was reading an article the other day about what a huge percentage of high school students have already picked their major by the time they are done with high school. So it's really, it's so important for us to be able to reach those younger audiences. And I think that's one of the reasons that I think about that too. Hang on. Okay. Please let me know if I get a little bit bogged down, because it's storming here. So if you miss anything, I can repeat. Just let me know. Okay, so hello. My name is Meghan Courtney. My title is the Archivist for Academic Programs at the Bentley Historical Library at University of Michigan. The title is a little bit confusing. Mostly it means instruction. A lot of what I do is instruction, but it can kind of go beyond that. It's designed to be a somewhat broad category. You can imagine that historically most of this work has been related to students here at the university, but I have been in this role for about a year, and I did instruction for a long time before that elsewhere, and I'm bringing my desire to work with K-12 and think about local history more to this space. So I'm hoping to expand that quite a bit. But today I'm going to share with you a little bit about a recent project that we did. We are part of a system that has other archives in it here at the university. But because we have the university archives and focus on the state of Michigan, we're most likely to have stuff that's related to local history. Some of the other units on campus focus on other kind of collecting focuses. So I wanted to share with you today about a recent project we did in a very similar theme to what some of the questions that Amalia's groups were thinking about, except that in this case, lucky for us, they are thinking about these questions at the K-12 level. So this is something that we were kind of able to partner with an existing program through the Ann Arbor Public Schools. It is bringing together all of the different high schools, including some that are really big that have thousands of students, some smaller ones that might be more the shape of an alternative school, things like that. And all of the students at all of the schools in the district were thinking about this history of racism and resistance theme for the class. So they had a year-long class that they're doing in their local schools. But for this partnership that we worked on with them, they did sort of a mini conference where they zoomed in on the local area. So previously they're thinking about national level questions of racism and resistance. And now they're applying some of those things that they know to their own communities and their own kind of world around them. Each school sent some representatives, and each school had their own project topic that they're working on. Some of those examples are they were thinking about desegregation, both in schools and like community geographic areas. Restrictive covenants, which is a big one in the Midwest, thinking about the ways that racism looked different in these areas, but was baked in a way that might not be apparent at face value. Gentrification more broadly, a lot of these students are really dealing with that in their own lives. Ann Arbor is a very expensive place to live, but it was not always that way. And also thinking about the names of buildings, the sorts of people that are being celebrated and why that might have been decided. So in the morning, the students got to hear from a historian from the university who shared her own process and really did a lot of work to get the students excited about applying curiosity. And that's a theme that we use quite a bit, but it was great to have that introduction from somebody who's a really enthusiastic historian themselves and who could put a very personal spin on what it means to bring yourself to the research process, especially when dealing with local history. So in this case, it is a big benefit that you are a part of this community. Even if you've never set foot in archives before, you're bringing a little bit of kind of existing knowledge to the table that's really, really valuable. So this kind of subset of students split into groups again, and some of them came to visit us and get some hands-on experience with the materials, and others stayed at the district library and thought about historic newspapers. And then they were going to compare notes together after that and sort of continue working on their project. So we did promise to talk about outreach, and I wanted to touch on that. But I'm not going to lie, the truth is it developed out of existing relationships. I think that's a really common way for us to do it. And that faculty member that gave them the talk in the morning is essentially the person that we talked to about this. I mentioned that we're interested in doing more with high school, and it just happened kind of fortuitously that this was available to us. So in terms of that, you know, being out there, telling people what you're interested in really does help. I will say that in order to prepare for the session, I did some meetings with both the history professor to hear about what she planned to say so that I could jump off from there rather than repeating myself, boring the students, but also meeting with the teachers a little bit. And we were really lucky to have in that group the district social studies coordinator. And I do want to say in my experience, it's really, really helpful to have somebody who has a little bit of an opportunity to at least influence curriculum decisions, be a part of these conversations. You know, from experience, I will say it really hurts to work on like a place-based lesson with a single teacher who's really into it, but to then have the district buy a prepackaged curriculum that doesn't really have a local focus at all. So if you can get in front of those people who can then know that you're available and like can help to support this local place-based question, it's really, really helpful. Seek out that person if you can. So thinking about the design, when I was preparing for this session, I worked a little bit more on my own subject background knowledge than I normally would, in part because with high school students who are brand new to archives, it might be a limited capacity for you to say, I don't know, you look it up. So giving them a little bit more guidance than I might with an undergrad class who's coming up with a graded paper after this, I wanted to give them a little bit more support. We tried to go with a structured activity, so keeping it open-ended questions, thinking about the voices that they're hearing and thinking about where their own curiosity lies. So echoing that curiosity from the morning session with the history professor, gave them a place to jump in, even if they did not feel super comfortable at first pass working with those archival documents. I tried to make it so that any of the stations had something that's thematic but would work for each school team. So for example, thinking about urban renewal as a theme, there's going to be stuff about gentrification. There's going to be stuff about naming places. There's going to be stuff about, thinking about population changes over time and the statistics that would support that. So each of the students could jump in anywhere and figure out something that has to do with their project. I did try really hard to mirror kind of a real life research experience. The picture here is not actually this group because with K-12, we have a policy that you can't take pictures of their faces. So these are adults who signed a form. But I usually do give them the whole box. I pick out something specific in it and I point them in a direction, but they're able to see that the box exists, that it's part of this bigger body of things, and that sometimes results in them feeling curious about something else in the box, and that is okay with me. That's something that, if it works for them, then that's good. But I do think it's useful for them to know that it comes from this big collection, that that's a necessary context for them to have. I also think it was really useful to have the students debrief their experience without us. So, we can feel very intimidating, but for them to be able to be kind of honest about the experience with each other and also with their teachers, I think was really useful. I did try to make choices in a couple of themes. So again, that personal connection, I think this is the best part about thinking about local history, is that sometimes you get a group in and they're like, oh, I know this person, they're my neighbor. People bring this to the table and immediately it matters to them in a way that sometimes, especially for younger students, things can feel very distant, very, not related to their lives at all. Again, something could ring a bell at any of the stations they went to, but I also think it's really essential to make choices for community groups, K-12, whoever it might be, that sort of allow for different points of entry. We're not trying to force them to learn how to read handwriting, right? We just want them to be inspired, step one. So in that case, I really focus on selecting lots of different formats. And I have to say, maps. People love maps. People of all ages love maps. Teachers love maps. If you have a group where not everybody is a strong reader, they can look at a map and say, I have some frame of reference for this already, and I'm willing to take a step further and observe more about it. So if you have maps, work those maps. That's my tip. Okay, some challenges that we did encounter that I think are worth mentioning. So obviously, K-12 teachers are not usually, sometimes they are, but not usually professional history researchers who use an archive all the time. And I bring this up to point out that sometimes they will make a request that seems simple on their end, but is really, really hard on our colleagues. So managing expectations is a part of this for sure. This applies to a community workshop. If you have community organizers in, they might ask for something, and being willing to say that'll take a long time, but how about this? Or are you willing to wait 4 weeks? These kinds of expectation management is a different angle with more kind of public local history questions. I would say also it was a little bit hard to only have one in-person session with them. I would have loved to give small chunks so that they could reflect a little bit in between and come to us with maybe some questions that we would be better equipped to answer. This is not true just for K-12. I'm sure all of you have had this experience before, but sometimes students come in thinking I have a specific question in my mind and I'm going to answer that question today. And it doesn't really work that way, right? We're kind of on a journey of discovery, but they kind of need to be introduced to the records to have a sense of that. So having a couple more sessions, I think in the future will be really helpful to give them that space to think about it. Takeaways, tips, a couple things. For local history in particular, things bubble up naturally that really help connections to be made. So I would say look for events that are already happening in the community. Sometimes there's a festival. In past jobs, I've done things like take archives related stuff to like the Pride event in the city, stuff like that. Ann Arbor's Bicentennial is coming up next year, so we're really excited to build this partnership through that already existing thing that's going to be, you know, partially staffed by other people, supported in many ways, already getting a lot of publicity. It's a good way to get things in front of people that they might not otherwise see, or people who think they don't like history might encounter your stuff. And then, like I said, having a plan for those after the fact requests, you know, there were a couple things I normally would not have hopped to quite as quickly to like scan with a phone app really quickly. But for these students, I kind of made special arrangements so that you know, their timeline is different. I can't tell them to wait 4 weeks for a scan. So kind of different plans, making sure that your colleagues are ready and that they understand they might get some researchers in that are a little fresher and might need a little bit more support. What else do I have here? And then I'm really excited about continuing to build this relationship. So in the fall, we're planning a session so that archivists and the teachers can kind of come together and spend a little time without the students, talking about the process, talking about feedback, talking about thoughts for next time around. And I think it's really important to kind of carve out some space for collaboration and not always be teaching. Okay, I'm going to pass it off at this point and let me stop sharing.
Okay, and I will start sharing. Hi all, my name is Kira Dietz. I'm the Assistant Director of Special Collections and University Archives at Virginia Tech. I'm located in Southwest Virginia and in a northern southern part of Appalachia, depending on who you ask. And so, like many special collections and archives, local history is an area in which we focus. To give you a little context for us, we focus on Blacksburg as our local town and community, Montgomery County, which is the county in which we're situated here in Southwest Virginia, surrounding counties in this entire region. And then we get into other areas of Appalachia that are adjacent to us. So northern North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, West Virginia, and things like that. So we have a pretty broad concept of local history for us, and that can benefit us in a lot of ways. And sometimes it's a little bit tricky. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about Hokie for a Day, which is a program that we got involved in for the first time this past year. And it's a little bit of a jump from what my colleagues have been talking about, because we are talking about a high intensity 2-activity, 10 minutes group of kids, specifically 5th graders. So just to give you a little bit of background, I've been here at Virginia Tech for about 15 years, a little less than that. And instruction is a relatively significant component to what I do, and that includes K through 12. So I've been working with this age group for quite some time. For the last decade, my colleague and I have been doing a recurring program with our town middle school when they do Civil War history. And in recent years, we've expanded that into space history, because aerospace and aeronautical history is also an area in which we collect, which is really fun when you have kids looking at Civil War letters on one side and Apollo 11 mission plans on the other. Try to put that together. We have done recurring events for specific local history topics or general introduction to special collections for K through 5 kids, pretty much K through 8. So local elementary schools and middle schools. These are not necessarily local history focused, but it very often becomes a component because this is a thing that students may relate to, they may ask us about, they may have questions. We occasionally have visiting upper high school groups that come to do research. And generally speaking, these are programs that have been like 45 minutes to 75 minutes. So that what we might think of as that one-shot program. All of that to say, to bring us to Hokie for a Day, which is almost the complete opposite of all of that. So Hokie for a Day is a program on our campus where 5th graders have an opportunity to come to campus for about 2/3 of a day. This visit includes them learning about college majors. They get to have conversations with people about how to get into college. They go to the expo, which is what we're going to focus on because that's where I had a role. But they also go to lunch at a dining hall. They get to talk to student athletes. They get to walk around campus and get this experience. And then what's significant about this program, it is open to Title I schools only. So these are often students from low income areas, in surrounding counties and places throughout Southwest Virginia. I work in and live in a place that is largely rural. And I think it's worth noting in the last year, our institution has had a 5% increase in applicants who were first generation college students. So back to some points that some of my colleagues have made earlier, sometimes this is your one opportunity to introduce young students to special collections and archives and maybe give them something to remember, we hope, so that when they encounter us down the road, they have that takeaway. So this is kind of just the itinerary for the program. And they have what is called this STEAM Expo. So, science, technology, engineering, arts. The way it basically works is there are 6 tables spread out across the mezzanine level of our art center on campus. And each group who's participating that day is at a table. So we had a 6-foot table that we knew we were going to have available to do some sort of activity. And you're told we're going to have 60 students in 1 hour. So you get 6 groups of 10 kids for 10 minutes. And it is like a tornado. And we'll talk a little bit more about the chaos that ensues a little later. So with the fact in mind that we knew we were only going to have 10 minutes with each group, and we were going to have to do the same activity over and over and over again, we wanted to make something repeatable. This was something really different for us. It was a big jump from planning 50 minutes with a bunch of kids sitting in a classroom to kids going by almost like they're going to be on a conveyor belt. So we were coming up with some strategies. My colleague and I, who volunteered to do this program, as it were, we're thinking about engagement, right? What can we do we can do with them in 5 to 10 minutes? How can we expose them to what Special Collections and University Archives does and why they might care about this in the future? What can we get them to try and remember or take away, knowing that there's all these other things going on? And we did actually focus on local history. I don't know that it was like 100% intentional when we started, but as we were talking about our activities, it just sort of made sense that this may be something that will speak to these students because maybe it's their history. Because the schools are not all from the same county or same area, there was no guarantee we were going to hit on everyone necessarily. But as we developed our 2 activities, it kind of worked out that way. And we had a little bit of time to, a little bit of opportunity to play around with that as we went. So as I said, 2 activities, 10 minutes, switch and repeat over and over again. So we did some really different things for us. I promise I did not cut up original materials despite what the picture looks like. So one idea we had was to take some original reproductions of documents. So we scanned some letters from a couple of different collections here in Southwest Virginia, and essentially cut them up into puzzle pieces, because I thought this is a challenge for the students, maybe in a couple of different ways. It'll get them to think about looking at handwriting that might be different, because I don't know about y'all's experiences. Students here, when I meet with younger kids, they don't teach them cursive anymore. So this is a writing challenge. What can I read? What can I comprehend? And so, but I tried to shake it up a little bit. We actually have, you see 2 different pictures here of a letter, a reproduction of a letter, a cut up version that I actually did 3 different puzzles. So they kind of had varying degrees of difficulty. Like we started out with the 8-piece one to give them a sense of how the activity was going to go. And some of them built up to a 9-piece, and some of them built all the way up to the one you see in the center, which was 16 pieces that we had sort of taken this one handwritten letter and cut up. The other activity we devised involved working with historical and contemporary photos, because we have a very large historical photograph collection here, and history pins. So my colleague who developed this activity was really interested in using history pins. So we had 4 sets of photos where there was an old photo and a more recent photo, and the students had to match up the photos based on context clues from the images. And then they looked at some of those locations on history pin and got a 1-minute lesson on what history pin is and how they could explore it. So we dove into this. We figured it would be chaos, but it would be the fun kind. It is not a spoiler. It was chaos. One thing I should point out, as I said earlier, there were a number of different tables. So we were one of several stops on the tour. This meant we were part of a group of about 80 people in one space in 6 groups with students moving around and occasionally a lot of loud noises. One day we had balloons bursting. Another day we had rockets and hydraulics going off. One day we had the team next to us building volcanoes with sand. So us sitting there with our little reproductions, maybe not as exciting as literal rockets, but we did have a lot of fun. So last year, overall, we did this event 3 times. It happens, I think, about 8 or 10 times over the semester on different Wednesdays. So people rotate in and out of the program. Not everybody does it every day or every week, but you're kind of put into a schedule. So we did this twice, like I said, with 3 people, myself, my colleague, who's our oral history archivist, who developed the history pin and photo activity, and then one of our student assistants who very boldly agreed to come with us on this adventure. So basically when we would get a group of students, we would break them into 2 groups, and we had them work together for about 5 minutes on each activity. So they could work on one puzzle with all 5 of them. They could work on 2 different puzzles in smaller groups, depending on how they sort of sorted themselves. And then the history pin students were working with my colleague. And then we would swap them to switch activities. We did give everybody pencils that said Special Collections and University Archives. We have a little bit of swag, so we did get to send them home with that. And then there would be a lot of clapping, and then we would rotate to the next group and start all over again. So it was the fun kind of chaos. If you've worked with the younger kids, you know you never know what kind of questions they're going to ask you about the materials, about yourself. I have alternatively been asked if I fought in the Civil War, if I was alive during the moon landing. I get asked all kinds of questions, or they want to tell you everything they know on a topic. So we got into this. What did we take away from this? Despite my original mentality of, wait, what did I just sign us up for? Because I was fully in charge of this. This was all my doing. This was not a bad plan. This was a really different way for us to engage with a group that we don't often get to engage with. And I have not looked back with the, oh my gosh, what was I thinking mentality. We do know that a large group of 5th graders in an echoey arts center are very loud, but this is where clap if you can hear me comes in handy. And we all discovered our teacher voices. My favorite story was we finished up one day and the students had dispersed to the bathrooms to get ready to go to lunch. And then 2 of them came running around a corner at like top speed through an open lobby. And my student assistant, who is, a 21-year-old junior, just goes, "No running." And they just bolted to a stop. So I had no idea she had a teacher voice in her, but she did. And boy, did it work on those 10-year-olds. Despite some concerns that maybe students weren't going to be able to engage with us because this was a high intensity activity, on the whole, they did. They got really excited in like solving the puzzles and matching things up. They didn't necessarily, a lot of them struggled with the cursive writing issue, but I did also provide them transcripts so they could get the content of the letters as well as the context, and that they would have an opportunity. A lot of them, there was usually like 1 or 2 minutes left over before we switched groups. So a lot of these students were really interested in taking on the challenging, the harder puzzle, or like asking if they could look up like their hometown on History Pin when we had the laptop out. And as much as we could, we engaged with that. We encouraged them. We would look at a lot of the areas around here are very rural, so they don't have a whole lot of content on History Pin. Blacksburg itself does, and Roanoke, which is our big city up the road, also does. But a lot of the communities that these students were from don't have that level of historical information. And we talked about that as a learning experience with the students too, that there may be historical societies in their towns that maybe could contribute to this if this was something that interested them. And while this was a whirlwind, it was a really interesting opportunity for us to think about how to engage students quickly, almost like that, rather than planning a much longer sort of hour-long program. So in terms of what's next, yes, we are doing this again. I have already signed up for some or agreed to do some dates in the fall, and provided those to the program coordinator for this event. But there's some sort of takeaways, right? We think we might consider updating or replacing the photo activity and the history pin activity with something different, because the one downside to it is when you have 5 or 6 kids gathered around one laptop, it's not the best scenario. And we didn't really think to bring, well, we might be able to bring a larger screen, but we don't have a whole lot of physical space in the area that we're in. I think we're going to rethink the local part of local a little bit. We were pretty specific to Blacksburg because that's the material that we know. But in learning, as I did, that this program includes schools that are not just from our county and that they're actually from a lot of areas, we might want to focus a little more on broadening what local means, which is something that we already do with our collecting. And then I'm hoping we might be able to recruit more of our student assistants who work here to help, because I think they actually get a lot out of this too, in learning what it can be like to engage with younger students. The student who did come with me on these programs in the past is planning to go to library school. So I was like really excited that she wanted to embrace this. But I think there's a lot that other students can learn about the work that we do with younger groups as well. So that's kind of, it was a whirlwind experience. I have had a lot of fun with it. I'm looking forward to doing it again. But that's kind of where I'm going to leave that. I did see a note from somebody. Yeah, cursive writing has been out of the elementary school program in Ontario since 2006. Yeah, so the students that I talk to are just like, they don't teach us this anymore. So some of them can read it, but the majority of the younger students we work with don't read cursive handwriting anymore. So, I will